Thank you very much, Rich. This is David Abramson again. I'm going to introduce my colleague, Alexis Mergenoff, who is a sociologist at NYU, works alongside me in our Public Health Disaster Center called PIR Squared. It stands for Population Impact, Recovery, and Resilience. And what we're going to present, what Alexis is going to present to you is really what Rich was just talking about. What does the community look like? What does East Boston look like from the perspective of the residents, from the perspective of the organizations? How cohesive is the community? And I think you'll find it very interesting. We also drew on expertise from some of our colleagues, including Dr. Brian Mayer, a sociologist at University of Arizona, and Dr. Neha Gondal, who is at Boston University. As a reminder, for those who may be having some difficulties hearing us, under the interpretation button, if you turn it off, you should be able to hear this more clearly if you don't need the Spanish channel on. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alexis.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Saturday morning. We really appreciate having you with us. So I'm going to share my screen and go through a few slides that show our results for two key components from the Scale Up project. This will take about 10 minutes or so. And I'm going to talk about the residential survey that we did, as well as a network mapping analysis of East Boston organizations. So let's first talk about the residential survey. So the goal of our survey was to develop a snapshot of what East Boston residents think about climate change and extreme weather events, their readiness for emergencies and disasters, their sense of community and political efficacy, and opportunities for action. So we were really fortunate to work with the NOAA youth organizers to collect data for our face-to-face surveys. They worked really hard and went door to door to randomly sampled households throughout East Boston from June until November 2019. And they completed 273 surveys. We focused on these three zones, which you can see in the map on this slide. And these zones generally approximate three East Boston neighborhoods: Orient Heights, Eagle Hill, and Jeffries Point. And we picked these neighborhoods or zones based upon the 2030 flood maps from Climate Ready Boston. Now, since we have very limited time to review these results, I just wanted to share some really high-level findings. Of course, if you would have any questions or want further information about the residential survey, please let us know. We have a nice executive summary that goes into further detail of our results. So what are some of the key takeaways? Well, first, we had 273 respondents, and they were nearly evenly split among the three neighborhoods. In East Boston, people had a really high sense of community. They really liked where they lived. It was an overwhelming percentage of people who liked living in their neighborhood. A majority of respondents reported that they had lived in Boston for less than 5 years. Most were renters. And about 60% of the surveyed residents believe that climate change is affecting US weather. And we found this to be pretty encouraging because it means that we can put effort into developing solutions rather than spending time trying to convince people to really believe in the science that supports that these changes are happening. So these next two slides, we're going to highlight what we consider to be some opportunities for us to discuss, particularly today as we move forward with the day, but also to think about in the months and years to come. So first, a majority of East Boston residents who answered our survey had low levels of political efficacy. And by this, we mean people wanted to be involved in the political process. They thought it was really important, but they weren't quite sure how to get involved. There was a high level of trust in climate and extreme weather experts. This is also reassuring because it means if there is perhaps a hurricane warning that's issued, that people will take that seriously. Now, however, most respondents were not prepared for future disasters, despite believing it was very or somewhat likely that they would experience a flood or hurricane in the next 5 years. And if we break this down a little further, looking at those who had prepared the following items for an emergency, we see that the best that we have here are those who have a flashlight, and that's about 50% of surveyed residents. About 40% had copies of critical documents. About 28% had 2 days worth of food and water. A little less than 20% had radio and batteries available. Only 14% had a communication list, and only about 7% had an evacuation plan. So again, let's try to keep some of these findings in mind as we move throughout the day. And again, think about these as opportunities for us as we move forward with our planning. Okay, so now I'm going to transition into talking about the results from our organizational network study of East Boston. The survey was sent to about 140 civic, governmental, nonprofit, and commercial organizations who serve East Boston. And we were able to identify these potential respondent organizations with the help of NOAA, as well as some publicly available data sets. Again, if you have any questions as I go throughout these slides, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. And just a little bit more information about the survey itself. It took about 20 minutes. We asked respondents, representatives of these organizations about the extent and strength of their organizational ties with one another. We had 40 organizations complete the survey, and their responses represent about 132 total organizations who appear in our analyses. And I want to highlight that while we have a 40% response rate, which is really good, we still consider these analyses to be preliminary, and we're still digging into them. Okay, so I like to joke that this looks like a complicated game of Twister. It's not. This is what a network an analysis map looks like. And what network analysis helps us do is model real-world systems. It allows us to see which organizations might play central roles, in this case, in the East Boston community. And you'll notice in the bottom right-hand corner that we have a legend there, where these blue circles or nodes represent government and political organizations. Red represent educational. Orange represents housing and social services. Pink is health, and yellow are community focus groups. And we have a few key takeaways with this figure. First, you'll notice this is a really dense network, okay? It has really high reciprocity. And this means that those who filled out the survey, that 6 out of the 10 ties that they named were named back, okay? So we have a lot of reciprocity between organizations. Now, let's also look at the center of the network here. And what we see are quite a few blue circles that are centrally located, blue nodes. And what this suggests is that the governmental and political organizations, they play a pretty central role across East Boston. Now, we also asked organizations to answer questions about the types of exchanges that they had with the organizations that they named. And here's a figure that shows the central brokers in transactional networks. And by transactional ties, what we're trying to get at is, whether organizations coordinated efforts with one another, if they share resources, and if they share information. So I want you to take just a quick second and think about who these nodes might be. Now, you obviously don't know who answered our survey, but you know the community well. So who might you think plays a key role in the community in terms of sharing information, sharing resources when it comes to different organizations? And now we're going to show you who those folks are. So you'll see BPDA, Representative Adrian Madaro, East Boston Main Streets, and Boston Neighborhood Services East Boston are the central government and political organizations. You see the East Boston YMCA also plays a central role, and it's also the only central educational node that we had among our survey respondents. Now, what I want you to focus your attention on are the community focus groups, those yellow nodes, and how so many stand out as central brokers. However, you'll see that they're kind of on the periphery of those central brokers, right? And what we think is that there's an opportunity here to give community focus groups a real boost. They seem really well positioned to play an even bigger role, especially when we start to think about climate resilience and how organizations can help facilitate the community resilience of East Boston when it comes to climate change. And just to wrap up a little bit here, what we did here was break out the transitional networks by sector. And the key takeaway here is that different organizations organize themselves in different ways. And you'll see here that some of these sectors are highly centralized, meaning that we have a couple of nodes right at the center there that play a key role in facilitating sharing of resources and information with other organizations. And then we have others that are more diffuse. And to break this down a little further again, um, we see this hub and spoke model network characteristic for the government and political sector. And here what we see are a few key organizations at the center who play a large role tying together the entire network. And if we compare this to the housing and social services sector, which is a little bit more distributed, we can think, what are the pros and cons of having a well-balanced network? Well, maybe having a well-balanced network can help us with the sharing of information and resources rather than it having fall on a select few. And so as we move forward, we want to think about how can we best organize the resources throughout different sectors so that we might be able to best mitigate the effects of climate change. And that's all I have. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Phil at this point.